The spiritual nature of man. Since we are considering man's nature in its striving for a stable and unified perfection as its end, we must devote less attention to the composite nature and concentrate on the nature of the higher, formal and spiritual principle in man. Besides, the composite nature of a being is mainly determined by the principle that raises it above all the other beings of the same category, genus, and gives it its distinctive excellence, the specific difference, by which it occupies a definite place in the hierarchy of beings. The proper end of a being depends chiefly on this principle, and all the other principles and powers in the being are directed and subordinated by it to this one end. A being's true, genuine, positive perfection and development are realized in the higher, formal element of nature, especially if that element, as in man, is essentially independent of the lower element. All the lower powers and dispositions serve the higher part, and if no other alternative is possible, must even be sacrificed to the perfection and development of the higher part, whenever they happen to impede and obstruct its progress. Accordingly, the real positive perfection of human nature is a thing of the spirit. From now on, the nature of the spirit will be the direct object of our study. We shall first inquire how the spirit in its own right, and as separated from the body, is capable of solid development and full perfection such as it ought to attain. Secondly, we shall examine how it can and ought to strive for this absolute perfection in an imperfect way while it is still united to the body. Man's spiritual nature consists in the power of vital activity, arising from the immaterial and hence simple, unmixed, noble substance and essence of the soul, along with a tendency to perfect itself up to a certain point by the actualization of a potency inherent in its faculties, and thus to repose in the fullness of its richly developed life as in its end. The two faculties of knowledge and love emanate from this immaterial nature, and love in turn is based on knowledge and directed by it. Other faculties are often included, such as emotion, freedom, and the like, but they are only consequences or modifications of these two powers. If anything else is to be added, it must be a power to move or affect some outside being, a power that has no immanent act, although it is put into operation by the immanent acts of the other two powers. The interior perfection, and consequently the interior end of man, so far as his spiritual nature is concerned, consists in the full development of these powers, that is, in knowledge of the supreme truth that lies within the orbit of the natural intellect, and in union through love with the supreme good to which the will by itself can attain, along with a peaceful, uninterrupted, joyous possession of such truth and good. Simultaneously with the growth of this inner life, the spirit enters into an orderly relation with the beings that are around it, under it, and over it, especially with God, its creator. The spirit must acknowledge and maintain this relationship by appropriate action in order to reach its external end. The created spirit, which, like the angels, is not held down by bodily ties, can develop the entire energy of its spiritual power right from the beginning. It can and must attain its internal and external perfection in an instant. This is no nebulous hypothesis. The full flowering of intellectual cognition can accompany the gift of nature. The will, with all the energy of its pure, simple power and inclination to good, which lie in the very nature of the spirit, has only to join and follow the intellect and decide once for all to love what is good and acknowledge the order in which the Creator has placed it. If this is done, nothing required for natural perfection is wanting. All the powers of the Spirit have matured and remain in a secure, permanent state, without desire for anything further. According to the teaching of St. Thomas, the will's inflexible constancy in good is not an effect of perfect natural knowledge, as is the case with supernatural, intuitive knowledge of God's goodness, but is a natural result of the decision the will makes with all its energy. In the same way, the obduracy with which spirits that have turned to evil unfailingly and with a certain consequent necessity harden themselves in malice without any possibility of conversion, is not the effect of natural necessity or of a supernatural influence coming from God, who does not cooperate with evil any more than he withdraws natural powers for good, or of the condition of their knowledge. This situation can arise for no other reason than that the simple spirit, with undivided and unrestrained force, turns away from its true end and reverts upon itself. We must likewise admit that without God's supernatural influence, and apart from any reason based on knowledge of the good, the will of the pure spirit is permanently confirmed in good by its unreserved, undivided decision in favor of good and its subordination to its true end. Accordingly, the pure spirit's natural perfection can be achieved in an instant. By deciding to love the good which it knows, it enters into complete and secure possession of that good and reposes in it. A gradual, slowly progressing development does not take place. In a similar way, the human spirit, as soon as it begins to exist like a pure spirit, can reach its goal, the full development of its native powers and its untroubled definitive perfection. But as long as the soul is united with the body in a natural way, as I said above, it cannot fully develop the powers it possesses. Intellect and will are both hemmed in. The mind can have only a defective knowledge of objects akin to it, the higher spiritual objects by which it is to be perfected. The will, partly because of the dullness and inconsistency of the intellect, partly because of involvement in so many other lower appetites, cannot decide irrevocably either for good or for evil, and so cannot enter into a peaceful, secure possession of its good estate. A healthy, though gradual progress and growth may occur. The somewhat restricted and latent faculties that require development begin to turn toward their goal and to pursue it. Yet their full maturity in the state of beatitude is not precisely the result of their activity, in the way the tree grows from the root, the bud from the tree, the blossom from the bud, and the fruit from the blossom. By striving for its perfection and realizing it to the degree now open to it, the faculty is made ready to pass from the present state to another in which its full, free, sudden flowering becomes possible. While the soul is in the body, it must use its faculties as best it can, and aspire after that knowledge and love of good which will eventually make it happy. It must also acknowledge the relations it has to other beings in this state, especially to the Creator, and must warily keep on guard in difficult circumstances, that it may become worthy of one day finding itself, to its joy and happiness, in better and more secure relationships. During the present preparatory period, which is a time of striving for a goal, love for the good predominates. The blessed state of perfection has to be merited by action. Knowledge of the good to be possessed may be somewhat less energetically pursued. It need not be cultivated so intensively. Whether it is more or less cultivated during the preliminary period is of less importance, or of no importance at all, for arriving at full maturity of knowledge in the higher state. Thus the human soul has a perfect final end, namely, the culmination of growth it reaches in the state of its full freedom and repose. It has also an imperfect, proximate end, namely the orderly development of its powers in the direction of the last end, the consummation of all desire. Up to this point we have been speaking of the end and the growth of spiritual life in the abstract and in general. Let us now see in what the end consists concretely and in particular, and how the detailed development proceeds. At the same time, this investigation will disclose the limits possible for natural progress. The internal goal of the spirit, as we have said, is union with the highest good, or possession of the highest good, that can be reached by knowledge and love. The external end is the spirit's harmonious and orderly relation to all other beings. The highest good with which the created spirit can enter into union by knowledge and love is undoubtedly God, the nature exalted above all other natures, and the supreme absolute cause of the spirit's own nature. Consequently, the latter is meant to be united with the divine nature by knowledge and love. It is meant to be thus united because it has the capacity for this union in its own natural powers. If, as we are taught by sacred scripture, we can come to a knowledge of God's majesty, glory, and beauty by contemplating the great beauty of material creatures, how much more readily can the spirit know God and marvel at his beauty by contemplating its own essence, which is so like to God. This is the knowledge of God that matches the spirit's natural power. The spirit knows God, not as he is in himself, but as he appears in his works, which contain traces of his glory, like an image that is reflected in the mirror of creation, though only in rough outline and in faded colors. The proposition that a creature, even a spirit released from the shackles of the body, cannot with its natural powers behold God immediately in his own essence, is a truth so firmly established by the teaching of sacred scripture, the unanimous voice of tradition, and the declaration of the Church itself, that it excludes all doubt. The same truth can be cogently demonstrated on solid philosophical grounds. The following proof seems to be quite clear. As power to know depends on the immaterial nature of the knowing subject, this nature is the most immediate and natural object to which it is referred, and also regulates the measure of knowledge. Therefore, the spirit can know inferior things as well as it knows itself, but it can know higher objects less perfectly than it knows itself. The highest object of all, the spirit's transcendent infinite cause, it can know least perfectly, that is, only as reflected in the spirit's own nature and in other creatures. These give forth a weakly mirrored image in which the rays of the infinite sun are, as it were, infinitely broken up. Thus, the most perfect knowledge of God obtainable by the natural powers of the created spirit is a knowledge of God in his works, a knowledge in which God is seen as in a mirror, through a glass in a dark manner, 1 Corinthians 13:12. This mirror reflects only those rays which reach it, that is, those emitted from the surface of the mirrored object that is turned toward the mirror. But the mirror does not receive any rays from the hidden interior or from the reverse side of the object, and therefore does not reflect them. In a similar way, knowledge about God derived from his works can be perfect in its kind, without being absolutely perfect or disclosing the depths of the divinity. When the power inherent in nature achieves its full development, this is enough to perfect such knowledge in its kind and to bring nature to the maturity suitable for it. Let us advert to this principle. As long as the created spirit is left to its own powers and needs, its knowledge is no more than a knowledge of God derived from his creatures. More clearly, the created spirit's natural knowledge, the knowledge proportionate to its nature, is no more than a knowledge of God derived from created nature, that is, the nature that is proper to the spirit and is found in all other creatures. Nature, as the subject of knowledge, is also the proximate object of knowledge, and therefore regulates the measure of knowledge objectively as well as subjectively. Consequently, nature knows only so much about God as is externally revealed in nature, and has no idea about God's essence and properties beyond what it can gather from their influence on creation and the government of the world. God's nature or essence, as it is in itself and transcends all union with created nature, lies above the creature's natural knowledge and is therefore inaccessible and hidden, a mystery. Nevertheless, the spirit, by the natural light within it, knows from its study of creatures that God, as the ultimate and highest cause of all being, must be one and infinitely perfect, that he must combine in himself, in a more eminent way, and in supreme unity and purity, all the perfections found in creatures, that he is eternal and omnipresent, all-powerful, all-wise, and all-good. From the greatness and beauty of creatures, so closely related to one another in spite of their variety, the spirit gains some idea of the infinite beauty which must arise from the association of all those splendors in the harmonious divine unity. It knows God as its benevolent creator, whose love has given it existence, life, light, and in addition, so many images of his infinitely magnificent beauty. All this the Spirit knows and experiences joy and happiness in this knowledge. Having this, it possesses everything that it can and may require according to its nature. Nothing else is due to the Spirit as a creature. Indeed, perhaps it cannot even suspect that anything better is possible for it. How is it to suppose that it could in some way be made capable of immediately touching and seeing the infinite God, and thus embracing him in his essence as a whole, totum, though not wholly, totaliter? Would not the desire to draw near to that inaccessible light in which the immortal God alone dwells imply boundless temerity? How can the Spirit dare to aspire after a knowledge which belongs solely to the divine nature, which is due to God alone, for which he alone has capacity, which the Father has by his essence, which he communicates to the Son as the latter's glorious and distinctive inheritance? Neither doth any one know the Father but the Son, Matthew 11:27, which only the Holy Ghost, who proceeds from the Father and the Son and reposes in them, can fathom. For what man knoweth the things of a man but the spirit of a man that is in him? So the things also that are of God no man knoweth but the Spirit of God. 1 Corinthians 2:11. Only they who blindly persist in error can deny the principle that was established above and is so clear in itself, that the aspirations and rights of nature cannot reach beyond the horizon of their active power. That was the mistake of the Jansenists and of some theologians who unfortunately sided with them. They admitted that nature did not have the resources to see God's essence as it is in itself, but maintained that nature had a positive desire and title to the beatific vision as its natural end. This contention seems to us to be not only false, but to involve a contradictio in terminis, an intrinsic contradiction, as we pointed out when explaining the principle. God is the supreme object of knowledge, and hence the goal of the development of the natural intellect. He is also the supreme object of love, and consequently the goal of the will's development. Love of the good, which is inherent in the will, can and must rise toward the good, and repose in that good which is the good of every good. All the love which the Spirit naturally has for itself leads back, under nature's guidance, to its author. The Spirit loves God as its creator, to whom it belongs. It loves God as the infinite beauty reflected in 1,000 images, but most of all in the Spirit's own essence. It loves God as its greatest benefactor and loving protector. It must experience happiness and blessedness in this love, by which it is united with the highest good. And as the Spirit loves God, its Creator, to whom it subordinates the love it has for itself, so it subordinates all the love it has for its own equals to this higher love, and thus reduces love to its higher unity. This love which nature has for its Creator and Author is pure and noble. It is sometimes called love of God as our Father. It could more appropriately be called the love of a servant for his kind and generous master. For nature as such does not stand in filial relation to God. The creature as such is God's servant and menial. Only because the creature has its origin from God, though not by generation or quasi-generation, and is loved by God and loaded with benefits, though not with fatherly love or a son's inheritance, can it with some sense call God its Father and love him as such. But the creature cannot love God in the fullest and best sense of the word, with the intimacy and tenderness with which real or adopted children embrace their father. This natural love always implies great reverence. It does not effect, but rather forbids, the inception of a union between the Spirit and God resembling the union of a friend with friend or of father with son. The union resulting from natural love has more of respectful retirement in it than intimate association. The Spirit achieves its internal end by knowledge and love of God. The case is similar with the actions that proceed from knowledge and love of God, maintain the Spirit's relationship to God, and constitute its external end. The Spirit that was created by God, not because of any need but out of overflowing kindness, had to be appointed by God to be a witness of his glory. The Spirit has the duty of glorifying and serving God. This is done in the measure in which the Spirit knows and therefore manifests the glory of God, as well as in the way in which it loves God and therefore carries out his will in all things, out of love for him. By these means, the Spirit also enters into correct relationship with all other spirits. It loves them because they have the same nature as it has, and because they too are to know God, love him, glorify him, and serve him. It esteems them because they have a dignity and personality equal to its own. Thus we have come to a detailed knowledge of the natural end and the natural perfection of the created spirit. The internal end would consist in knowledge of the highest truth attainable for the spirit by its own nature. This is knowledge of God, the creating nature, a knowledge derived from created natures, mostly from the spirit's own nature, plus love of the highest good with which it is united through its own nature, that is, love of God as the creator and supreme Lord of its nature, and as the infinite beauty known through its own and all other created natures. The external end would be the establishment of orderly relationships to God and other spirits. To God by venerating and adoring him as the absolute principle of the spirit's nature, and by praising and glorifying him to the best of its ability. To created spirits by loving them and respecting their personality, and by living with them in intimate fellowship in the enjoyment and service of God. This is the perfect end attainable by the Spirit if it is left merely in its own existence and powers. All that has been said applies to the human soul after its separation from the body, as well as to the angels. If we regard the human soul in its union with the body, i.e., in the state of its growth, its relations, powers, and activities are substantially the same, but they are less perfect, and their development does not proceed along so straight a line. In this state, too, knowledge and love of God are the proximate end and the proximate interior culmination to be achieved by the Spirit. But the knowledge is less perfect because the spiritual intellect is directly concerned with the material elements to which the soul is united. Things of sense are its proximate and natural objects, and the soul is not able immediately to apprehend itself in its spiritual nature that is united with matter. Consequently, the knowledge of God that it can and ought to obtain in this state is predominantly a knowledge of God derived from the beauty and greatness of sensible nature. This is the way the human mind, including that of pagan philosophers, ordinarily comes to a knowledge of God, and sacred scripture itself teaches that man is impelled by nature to know God by this process. See Wisdom chapter 13 and Romans 1:17 and following. Natural love of God corresponds to this knowledge. However, love of the spiritual in general and of God in particular is considerably more hampered in its development by union with sensibility than intellectual knowledge is. I repeat, a natural love corresponds to this knowledge, for the soul's relations with God and spiritual things are not negated by its union with the body. This is a love whose power and tendency reside in the nature of the soul itself, as was taught by most of the fathers, who were not driven by their conflict with the Pelagians to introduce a different terminology under pain of misunderstanding. The Church, too, took official measures against the contention of Baius that such love proceeding from natural, philosophical knowledge and the powers of nature was prejudicial to the merits of Christ's cross. But I have pointed out that the progress of this love is incomparably more handicapped by sensuality than intellectual knowledge is. The reason is that sense knowledge is not directly opposed to intellectual knowledge, whereas sensuous love is often directly opposed to spiritual love, which has to struggle to escape its clutches. The flesh lusts against the spirit, and the spirit has longings that are opposed to the flesh. See Romans chapter 7. Moreover, although the yearning of the spirit is the higher, it is the weaker. Sensuality has its object directly before it, and the object exerts all its charm and attraction, whereas the spirit does not thus have its proper objects presented to it directly in their vitality and spiritual beauty, but only in the mirror of the sensible. And this weakness of the spirit in conflict with the flesh is so great that if God did not come to its aid and support with special help and strength, it would inevitably succumb to the flesh. Romans chapter 7. Therefore it is difficult, if not morally impossible, for the spirit by its natural power and inclination to love God, really to love him above all else, not merely in estimation, by esteeming him above all, but effectively by overcoming everything for the sake of God and resisting all temptations. But we should note well that this is a moral, not a physical impossibility, since this kind of love of God does not surpass the physical power or tendency of the Spirit, but it is quite in accord with it. If the love cannot go into action, the reason is found in the obstacles that thwart it. Even during the period of its union with sensibility, the soul can and ought to know and love God. As a natural growth and orientation toward interior perfection open up before it in this state, it also has an orientation and inclination toward a natural external perfection, consisting in activity of the moral order, which it must observe conformably with its nature. It has the same relation to God as that we specified for pure spirits, and it can live up to this relation in the same way as it can elicit love of God. Moreover, it enters into a special relationship of dependence on God. Because it requires God's special assistance to grow in goodness and to avoid evil, it must also in a special way honor God, thank him, and pray to him. The spirits that are close to it are, in the first instance, those that share in human nature with it, and are therefore likewise subject to a gradual growth in goodness and are in need of mutual assistance. Consequently, the general social relationships among spirits mentioned previously is modified to the extent that it exacts mutual esteem and love, particularly mutual support and help in spiritual and corporal needs, and checks all disorder in the legitimate pursuit of the end. Finally, a quite special moral relationship, that of the soul to the sense appetites inseparable from man, is added to the two already mentioned. The soul must safeguard its own dignity in the face of sensuality and secure dominion over it. All these moral relationships are normal for the human soul and constitute a natural system of morality. The relationships are naturally knowable because they have their foundation in nature. Thus we have a natural moral philosophy, in which a pagan such as Aristotle could advance to astonishing lengths by his keen analysis of human nature. In nature, too, are found the physical powers to love spiritual things and the supreme creative spirit, as well as to live in accord with known moral relationships in the manner described. Powers that can go into full action under God's natural cooperation and instigation, whether general or special. Consequently, there is a natural moral life and a natural moral activity. The powers of the spirit, as contained in its nature, are somewhat hampered in their operation and require frequent exercise, energetic striving, and unremitting pursuit of the good before they can develop their activity easily, quickly, and efficiently. Their inclination must be tempered and strengthened, particularly in situations where sensuality directly or indirectly tends to withdraw them from what is good. The power that is thus tempered, strengthened, and made fit is really virtue, virtus, perfected vis, which arises from the gradually crystallizing habit of the faculty owing to its good activity. The powers receive their perfect inclination to good in consequence of frequent effort and practice. But in themselves they already have a radical tendency toward good, to which the tendency acquired by habit has to be added. Thus the seed of the true virtues, semina virtutum, are buried in the natural faculties, and the seed grows in them. The presence of these natural seeds of virtue in nature accounts for the existence of natural virtues that have God, our neighbour, and ourselves for their objects. To summarize what has been said, we are confronted with an order based on man's spiritual nature, known by this nature, and to be carried out by its powers, an order that is meant to lead to a definite natural perfection, interiorly by knowledge and love of God, exteriorly by observance of its moral relationships. Briefly, in addition to the supernatural order of human development established, revealed, and inaugurated by Christ, man has a natural order based on his nature. This would be the permanent order destined for man if God had not decreed something better, and in a tenable view of many theologians, would even now be the established order subsequent to original sin, if God had cancelled all our relations to a higher supernatural end. This means that a purely natural state would be possible. That is, a state without any genuine supernatural elements. At the same time, it indicates the correct middle ground between two contrary false conceptions. The Jansenists, like all the Gnostic and Manichaean sects, denied the possibility of any other good state of nature than that in which man, endowed with supernatural powers and virtues, would be truly a child of God, with the beatific vision as his inheritance. They turned what is really the supernatural state into a natural one, and thereby made it the only good state. Other heretics, on the contrary, turned what is really the natural state into a supernatural one. They refused to admit that nature as such has any active powers tending to natural goods, for example, love and knowledge of God, as explained above. Somewhat as we say that nature has only a receptivity for the supernatural, but no active tendency and power for it. To realize such objectives, they required as absolutely necessary those aids which in reality are not needed except to attain supernatural goods, such as belief in divine revelation and the Christian grace of justification. According to the first group, nature as such cannot be good without divine holiness. According to the second group, nature is, if not evil, at any rate blind and helpless. But according to the true doctrine, nature of itself possesses not indeed the higher divine goodness, but a human natural goodness. But it truly does possess such goodness in its own right, and is therefore the basis of a definite, well-rounded order of life. Since the second of these two errors is common among many who either do not know what supernatural really means, or destroy nature, we desire to dwell a little longer on this point. We must unconditionally reject all views according to which the soul, in any state of human nature, spiritual monstrosities in the individual need not be considered here, loses all spiritual power, or at least lacks energy or inclination to go into action. Owing to confused ideas about the present state, that is the result of original sin, many believe they must hold this sort of position. In their opinion, the human soul no longer has the ability to know what is purely spiritual, or at any rate, higher spiritual, divine things. In any case, such power would be so dormant and sluggish that it would have to be awakened from its sleep by the word of another spirit, and ultimately of God, before it would be sufficiently aroused to acquire an intellectual knowledge of sensible things, or at least of supersensible things. Many seem to fear that any admission of spontaneous development of higher knowledge in man would be not only rational but rationalistic. But just as the doctrine that nature of itself can will something good and can even love God without strictly supernatural grace is not Pelagian, so the contention that nature has the ability of itself to know some truth even about divine things is not rationalistic. Rather, the denial of the first assertion would lead to Jansenism, and that of the second would lead to the traditionalism which, in this application at least, has been rejected by the Church. The truth lies in the middle. The spiritual power of knowledge and love in the state of nature, in which the spiritual faculties are not completely free and independent because of their union with matter and the lower faculties, is indeed somewhat impeded and restricted, but it is not so chained down that it is deprived of all force and energy, still less that the faculties themselves are completely suppressed and consequently are intrinsically and physically, through lack of necessary vitality, unable to know and love spiritual things and God Himself. No, the power remains. Some inclination for activity also remains, so that up to a certain point, knowledge and love of God can always develop spontaneously. Without such a tendency, no natural vitality can be conceived. But the full, easy, speedy, and flourishing development of the powers is restricted. That such wholesome progress may take place, they require outside assistance, not by the addition of a new higher power, but by aids that will stimulate and support them. Therefore, it is rationalistic to maintain that the development of reason is not hampered by any restrictions, and that reason can mature quickly, easily, securely, and completely without any outside help, which in the last instance must be traced back to God. Further, it is Pelagian to maintain that the natural power and tendency of the soul to desire good and love God are not somewhat impaired by the downward pull of sense appetite, and are not so weakened that God does not have to come to their aid with special external and internal stimulation and strengthening influence to assure their uninterrupted, continuous pursuit and attainment of their end. Yet the truth remains that man, even in his purely natural condition, without supernatural revelation and divine grace, can know and love God in a fitting way, and so can prepare himself for his natural destiny. The external help we have mentioned can at best be called supernatural because it comes to nature from outside, but it is not simply supernatural, since it is an aid intended for nature and is necessary. It confers no new inner vitality and conduces to no exalted supernatural good transcending the powers supplied by nature. Coming as it does from outside, from another being, it is a mere external stimulation of the interior natural power designed to facilitate the removal of obstacles and to bring the object of activity closer. Thus, plants, for example, may require assistance from outside to be able to develop all the energy stored in the seed and to reach their natural growth. Ordinary cultivation is not always enough. Sometimes extraordinary measures are required. Yet the outside aid confers no new power on the plants, but only supplies the existing power with material and facilitates the exercise of their activity by removing impediments. If the plant should die, or at least were to lose all aptitude for growth, all the outside helps in the world could avail nothing. But if the seed is still alive, it has some chance of growing, and whatever else is needed cannot be supplied by conferring a new power, such as engrafting another seed, for in that case the existing power would not develop, but a new one would take its place. The external help consists in providing stimulation, material and aid in the overcoming of obstacles. In somewhat the same way, the help which God would impart to man's nature as such would suppose that its vitality and energy are not dead. It would further suppose that the vital acts to which aid is given are not essentially beyond the spirit's capacity, and hence are not physically impossible. If such acts cannot be performed, the reason is the presence of various obstacles in the way. Therefore, they are only morally impossible. This so-called moral impossibility is not in itself foreign to the will regarded as a morally free faculty. It simply means that the will, which by virtue of its freedom is often able to make a decision, is almost certain not to make the decision because of an urgent inclination toward the opposite. In a wider sense, we also speak of a moral impossibility with regard to natural knowledge, for example, of all the perfections of God, when the cause is not a lack of the physical power to know, but a deficiency in the requisite resources or in intellectual formation. More specifically, the help needed by pure nature is neither supernatural revelation nor supernatural grace. It is not supernatural revelation because aid can be given in various other ways than by God's direct speech to us men. For instance, by a strengthening of reason in individual people, by calling into existence a number of exceptionally brilliant men, or by a widespread dissemination of good education under the guidance of a wise providence. It is not supernatural grace because an intensified inclination of the will to good and a vivid, frequently renewed incitement to fear and love of God, resulting from his exterior and interior influence, are quite sufficient for gaining control of the passions. Briefly, nothing more would be needed than the sort of revelation admitted by many rationalists and deists, and the kind of grace allowed by some Pelagians, semi-Pelagians, and in more recent times by Hermes. This is revelation in the widest sense, by which truth is made known in any way at all, and the grace is likewise taken in the widest sense, that is, it is any special gift of the good God. But a revelation in which God himself speaks to us, to link our minds with his, to base our knowledge on his, and to introduce us to his mysteries, a revelation such as God has given in the Christian dispensation, and a grace that confers a higher heavenly value on our actions, making them meritorious for heavenly beatitude, and unites us with God by a true filial love, can by no means be needed as assistance in the natural order. And the more moderate rationalists and Pelagians, such as those we just mentioned, do not offend against Christian revelation and grace by admitting what they do. They err by remaining on this level and by refusing to grant a higher reason for the necessity of revelation and grace than weak nature's need of some help. They deny the real existence of a higher order and a higher life that are inaugurated by such revelation and grace. In reality, the present order is not natural but supernatural. This is the reason why we seldom or never view natural life in its full power, independently of the supernatural life that rests on supernatural revelation and grace. But we may not forget that they who reject and scorn the supernatural order confronting them also violate their natural relationship to God. They make themselves unworthy of natural help if they refuse to accept the supernatural help offered to them. The naturally good activity of those who loyally and thankfully receive revelation and grace blends with their supernatural activity and therefore does not stand out prominently. Yet the natural life of those who may still be ignorant of revelation can and in fact does develop. In the present economy of the world, however, natural life is often raised somewhat above the natural level because of the revelation that was made at the beginning, or the revelation which God can impart interiorly to man. Usually, indeed, all the activity men now perform is directed by God in one way or another to a supernatural end, just as, inversely, a sort of supernaturally evil power, that of the fallen angels, draws man from natural good to evil. We are now in a position to gather together what we have said about the capacity for the true and the good possessed by the human soul, conformably with its essence and nature. By virtue of its essence, the human soul has the power, and with it the inclination, to know the true and to love the good, and thus to aspire after perfect knowledge and love of God, and love of the highest truth and good. Read again. By virtue of its essence, the human soul has the power, and with it the inclination, to know the true and to love the good, and thus to aspire after perfect knowledge and love of the highest truth and good. But this power, constricted and hampered by other, lower and partly opposed powers, must in a suitable way be supported and fostered from without, especially by God. The certitude we have about this whole doctrine concerning man's nature, powers, and activities results from the simplicity and truth of the principles on which it rests. This teaching can and ought to be known by unaided reason, its source, because it refers exclusively to nature. But it is also supported by revelation and the infallible teaching of the Church, which is a secure guide even in natural truths that are connected with revelation. The Church necessarily supposes that there is a natural goal and end, for it teaches that the end now appointed for nature, consisting as it does in the beatific vision of God, is absolutely supernatural and is to be communicated to us by a special grace. And yet there must be a necessary end for nature. That man in the present state, considered only according to his natural powers, can know and love God in his own way is clear from the condemnation of many propositions contained in the works of Baius and the Jansenists. For these heretics attacked the doctrine as it is here reported, and as it was maintained in substance by almost all the theological schools of that time. After the conflict with the Pelagians, the Latin fathers either did not consider the nature of man at all, or treated it casually when they had occasion to speak of its capacity for true good, especially for love of God. This now strikes us as very strange. Even most of these scholastics, when they discourse about the good works which nature of itself is able to perform, mention only external actions such as building houses, planting trees, and the like. Particularly Augustine and Prosper, as the Jansenists were quick to notice, ordinarily based their proofs of the absolute necessity of grace not on the nobility of supernatural acts, but on the grounds of nature's tendency to evil, which to their mind was so strong that nature was unable by itself to rise to anything good or divine. All naturally good knowledge and love that had nothing to do with grace seemed to be excluded. But is it not also surprising, as the same Jansenists shrewdly perceived, that these were mainly views of the Latin fathers, not of the Greek fathers? The latter were accordingly denounced by the Jansenists as calumniators of grace, because they ascribed to nature so pronounced an inclination toward good, and even to the love of God, and were summarily refused a hearing as being untrustworthy witnesses for the nature of grace. And why did the Latin fathers hold the views they did? Because they had to wage battle against the Pelagians, and in this conflict concentrated their efforts on showing what nature could not do. Besides, they considered these questions only in their polemic bearing and practical application. They made no attempt to treat them comprehensively from the speculative point of view, or to break them down into their component parts and connect them with other doctrines. Against haughty Pelagianism, the fathers taught that not even one spark remained in us of that good we are accustomed to speak of in Christian circles, namely the supernatural good that is profitable for eternal life. They pointed out rather that an evil mass of combustible debris was contained in us, and that we were not able, by our own inherent powers, to prevent it from bursting forth into a fearful conflagration. On the one hand, therefore, they dispossessed nature even of the germ and the slightest seed of true good. On the other hand, they contended that a rank cancer of corruption was festering in nature. What nature was capable of doing without reference to salvation was simply omitted. This was beside the point, as Augustine often expressed it. Yet nature's ability to do good was occasionally acknowledged. That power of God's image by which it naturally does some good, in Augustine's words. Indeed, the question could hardly have been touched by the fathers, whereas it appeared to be the main difficulty in the opposite camp. For the erring teachers, particularly the well-meaning semi-Pelagians, thought they were contradicting Augustine's doctrine when they ascribed to nature some power for good. But this was not where the error lay. Had they ascribed to the nature created by God a power and inclination to good placed in it by the Creator, acknowledging that free will can strive for good in free cooperation with this God-given tendency, in accordance with our present conception of the power of nature, their opinion on this point would have been correct, and Augustine would have had to go more deeply into the question and show that the absolute incompetency of nature referred only to a higher order. But they taught a freedom that could give to itself the first impulse to good without dependence on any antecedent impulse, even a natural one, in the way the first man, still free from any tendency to evil, gave himself an impulse to sin, to which nothing drew him. This was a freedom that contradicts the natural as well as the supernatural order. To refute it, the fathers, strictly speaking, did not have to go into the distinction between the two orders. We may wish that they had done so, but since they did not do so, or only rarely did so, the cardinal point of the question could not receive adequate illumination. Yet the truth itself was firmly held by the fathers. Even Augustine, in his controversy with the Manichaeans, defended the rights of nature brilliantly when he taught that man's substance and essence were always good, and that consequently his essential powers were always good and remained capable of good, so that the freedom of the will could not be lost. But what was lacking in the Latin fathers was clearly and distinctly brought out by the more scientific Greek fathers. And even the Greek fathers, who were interested in practical affairs, often exhibit a more serene and comprehensive speculation than the fiery Augustine, who was ever in search of a solution to the burning questions of his day. And from the Greek fathers, the doctrine of nature and grace later passed over in all its clarity through the first scholastics to the Latin Church. We can gather this even from the Jansenists, who condemned and reviled the Greek fathers, and the scholastics equally, as defamers of grace and eulogizers of nature. We can also show convincingly that the doctrine of a self-enclosed order of nature and a superior sphere of grace, which reached its full development not long after the beginning of scholasticism, can be found in the ancient Greek fathers in all its details and ideas, including even the very terms of its formulation. The scholastics ordinarily taught without hesitation that nature as such was capable, by its own powers, of a natural knowledge and a love of God that, in its way, is a love of God above all else. God's help of the kind mentioned above is needed for this, but, we may remark in passing, divine assistance seems to be required, not for the purpose of loving God above all, but for the effectiveness of this love and its constancy in the face of strong temptation. Nevertheless, the examples the scholastics give of nature's competency in this area are such as we have listed. They refer merely to some external activity that is conformable to reason, such as building houses, planting gardens, and the like. But these are only examples. Nature is fully equipped for such works, and no higher influence can come into consideration. At the very first glance, we see that they involve nothing supernatural. I do not deny that a number of theologians, even such as agree with the principles established above, quite illogically restrict the powers of nature to external good works of this sort, on the grounds that they are purely human. But man's nature, precisely as human nature, contains something godlike because of the soul, by which it is the image of God, and because of its spiritual faculties, by which it can know and love God. If godlikeness is completely extinguished in man, his nature ceases to be a true human nature. It is the rational soul by which man can know and love God that accounts for what is truly human in man. This is what raises man above the beasts. Let no one say that nature, though good in itself, is made incapable of anything divine through sin. However shocking sin may be, whatever diabolical obduracy it may engender, good nature and the power and exercise of natural knowledge of God, as well as the power and tendency for natural love of God, are not destroyed by the evil will that resists them. Much less can such destruction be wrought by original sin, which, according to Jansenist teaching, involves an evil will on the part of the person encumbered with it, or by any personal sin of man, who, so long as he is a man, can never turn to evil with such obstinacy and decisiveness as completely to suppress the element of good within him. But we wish to bring this discussion to a close and erect the structure envisioned by us on the foundation that has been established.